morning and welcome to week 2. This is the first online week of this course. Hopefully your holiday weekend was restful and warm and inspiring, because I know yesterday was Martin Luther King Day. I made the mistake of showing up to the office yesterday, and yes, I'm inserting funny stories even when I'm not teaching in person, so sorry not sorry, you'll have to suffer through. Anyway, I came to the office yesterday, didn't even think that yesterday was a holiday, and I took the bus and it was really quiet for a Monday morning because there are 2 bus routes I usually take, and they're both usually pretty busy during the day because a lot of students take the bus, and it was very empty, and the bus dropped me off, and I get to the entrance of BSB, the Harrison Street entrance, and it's locked, and I'm sitting here like, why can't I get in? Like, it's the doors, all the doors are locked. I tried to swipe in with my ID because I can on the weekend and it wouldn't work. Thankfully, somebody was there with a key and let me in. So I go inside and the building is totally 100% empty. Like, there's not a student like napping on a couch. There's no hustle and bustle. And, it was 9:30, so it was class time. So it wasn't really a transition period. But you would think that there would be at least like 1 student sitting there. No students. I was the only person walking in the hallway, and I was like, what is going on? It's a Monday at 9 a.m. Like, why am I the only person here? Get up to the department, and that door was locked, so I was able to swipe in with my ID there. And I get to my office, and I'm like, there's nobody in the department either. And we're not morning people in this department, so I figured people probably wouldn't be here at 9:30 in the morning. But it was very dead. There was no cleaning crew. There was nobody in the other offices. And usually there's 1 person here when I get here. So I finally sat down, logged onto my computer, and checked my calendar, and I realized yesterday was a holiday. I could have been home in my pajamas yesterday, and instead I came to school. I am the nerd who comes to school during holidays, so aren't you lucky you get a super nerd teaching you for this course? Anyway, back to the relevant topic at hand. This week, we're going to look at violence at the micro level, and we'll talk about what the micro level is in a minute. So if you're like, what the hell is this? I promise we'll get to it. Please note that this video lecture may be lengthy. You're welcome to pause it and take a break whenever you need to and come back to it. I am not going to record myself via camera, 1, because the lighting in my office is terrible, and I am a millennial, so I am vain, and 2, because I don't want you guys to get distracted with whatever my face is doing, because sometimes it does things and I don't realize it. So my voice should be sufficient, and if not, I've posted the slides on Blackboard, and you're welcome to view them without watching this video at your leisure. I have placed periodic pause slides in here to give us a breather once you guys can take a break and kind of absorb what I'm saying, and 2, because I'm doing a lot of talking and I need a minute to just kind of take a breath. So I've put some pause slides in here. You're welcome to pause. You don't have to. You can just watch it right through. That's totally okay. Also note that in the slides that I've posted on Blackboard, I do put things in the notes section, so you're encouraged to take a look at those because they'll provide kind of more than what's just on the slide, because I didn't want to give you a lot of words on one slide, because that's a lot at one time. So from last session, remember we had some takeaways from last session. And the first is that violence is the whole or partial negation of agency through force. And remember that force isn't always physical. It could be direct contact. So it could be, me punching someone in the face, or it could be passive destruction. And we'll talk more about what some examples of passive destruction might look like later on in the course. Agency or autonomy is removed through dehumanization, or perceiving somebody as not human, and demonization, or perceiving somebody as scary or demonic or thuggish. Another takeaway is that violence has increased as the West has essentially colonized. As Western quote-unquote civilization has increased, so has violence. Violence is also about power. So those who have power want it. or want to keep it, sorry, and those who don't have it want it. So violent means of power maintenance or maintaining power and violent means of getting power are often viewed as acceptable. And if you think about it, take a look at the history of the country. How did colonizers come in and get power? They didn't do it by asking nicely. How did, different people come to power in other countries? Some, yes, there are elections and things, but violence, when it comes to gaining power, maintaining power, is often viewed as acceptable. Another takeaway is that violence creates a dichotomy, and essentially a dichotomy is just a system of two groups, two individuals, two things. And so this dichotomy is the us versus them that we talked about last session. And that us versus them in the United States is race, class, and gendered. So what I mean by this is that the us group, the group with the power, is largely white, male, cisgender, able-bodied, at least modestly wealthy. The them group, or the group without power, is not those things. Now, obviously, there are people that fit into the us group in some respects and the them group in other respects. So white women, for example, we fit into the us group because we're white. We fit into the them group because we're women. I've found that many times, however, people will, whether consciously or unconsciously, stick with the group that gives them access to power. So white women, for example, will side with the us group or stick with the us group because they're white, and whiteness means power in this country. And so they'll stick with the us group because they're white instead of the them group because they're women, because being a woman in this country means you don't have access to power. That's what I've found, in research, and that's what a lot of people have found as well. And you may disagree, but if you observe kind of how we interact with each other, you'll notice patterns similar to what I've said. Another takeaway is that our perception of violence is context dependent. And what that means is that we perceive violence as either appropriate or inappropriate based on who's committing it and what it's being used for. So if it's the us group, it's perceived as appropriate because we're gaining power for protection, or because we don't want to give it away, we perceive the other group as dangerous, whatever you want to say. If it's the them group, the violence is inappropriate, or it's perceived as inappropriate. So those are takeaways from last session. Again, think about those as we continue kind of through the course. But let's take a look at how this works at a quote-unquote micro level. And I've put several cheesy graphics in this presentation, so again, not sorry at all for this, like dad jokes, cheesy graphics. I love all of this, so if you don't like it, you'll have to suffer, I'm sorry. But let's take a look at kind of what the idea of this micro level even is. So there's this lovely, it looks kind of like a model of an atom for you chemistry nerds. And it's not, just put that out there. This is called Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory. Now, Bronfenbrenner was, I believe, a psychologist. He created this model to explain how children develop in the context of interacting systems. So children don't just develop out of nowhere. Their development is shaped by several systems that interact with each other. Now, people have taken this theory and applied it to a number of different things. This is kind of the most coherent image of this model I could find because it gets kind of confusing and kind of hairy. I've simplified it for this course, but I wanted to show you kind of where it came from. So as you can see, there are several systems or levels, I guess you could say. So I'm going to point out a few here with my handy dandy pointer. So obviously the middle one, that's us. I'm sorry, I can't draw with my mouse very well, so I apologize for any terrible drawings you see. The middle one is the self. So this is yourself, the individual, whomever. The microsystem here is an individual's immediate environment. So their family, their school, their friends, their church, their workplace, their neighborhood, immediate sort of environment. The mesosystem, or mesosystem, depending on how you pronounce things, is the interaction between the microsystem and the exosystem. It's a tricky system to get the hang of, and community psychologists and other psychologists take some time kind of really describing what it is. For this course, I've simplified it, and I'll explain it more in a minute, kind of what I mean by the mesosystem. But note, this is where it came from. The exosystem looks at institutional systems. So you're looking at churches, schools, politics, things of that nature. Now, note that the focus is not necessarily on an individual church or an individual or an individual politician. You're looking at institutions as a whole. So we're not looking at the behavior of one church. The behavior within one church would be considered a microsystem. But if you're looking at the behavior of several churches, say of the Catholic Church as a whole, that would be an exosystem. I know it sounds complicated. I promise it'll become clearer. The macrosystem is essentially culture. So this is our overarching beliefs and values. And there can be several macro systems existing, alongside each other in a country or in a state. And finally, there's the chronosystem, and this is time. So all of these sort of smaller systems, quote unquote, interact with each other over the course of time. We're not going to explicitly look at this system in class. I don't have a unit dedicated to time, but it's something to consider as we look at sort of specific behaviors and relevant events that have occurred in history and that are occurring now, and how time influences these systems, because obviously behaviors change over time depending on whether or not they're viewed as acceptable, particularly violence. So again, not looking at it explicitly, but it's something to consider as we continue. All right, take a minute, kind of digest it. Take notes if you need to. Feel free to draw in whatever. Do what you gotta do. All right, for this course, because that last graphic had a lot in there, for this course I've condensed it. We're not going to look at necessarily exosystem. I've combined the exo and mesosystem into one. The microsystem's on its own. I've combined parts of the exosystem and macrosystem into one. So there's a lot of combinations going on in here. So these 4 levels we're going to look at in class are the self, the microsystem, the mesosystem, and a macrosystem, or I call them levels. It doesn't really matter what you use. So if you've noticed, the course is broken up into corresponding units. So unit 1 is the micro unit, unit 2 is the meso unit, unit 3 is the macro unit. Pretty convenient, right? I've put self-directed violence in with micro-level violence because we're just going to look at self-directed violence on its own. There's not a lot else to talk about for the purposes of this course. So I've combined it with micro-level violence. This unit looks at microsystems. So we're going to look at one's immediate sort of environment and individual behaviors. For this course, microsystemic events occur between individuals. So if you've noticed, I put micro as individual, meso as group, and macro system or institution. And I apologize for the wonky sort of graphics in here. Microsystemic events or microsystemic behaviors occur between individuals. We'll look at the other levels later, so you don't have to think about them too much right now. Look at the micro one. So how does this relate to violence? Because we've talked about all these micro, meso, macro, there's different levels. We haven't really talked about how they relate to violence. So I've given you more diagrams, which I'm sure is a great time for you. But I find diagrams helpful. This is a violence pyramid. I'm not the first person to use this pyramid, nor will I probably be the last person to use this pyramid. Academic people and policy workers have been using similar pyramids for years. I find that breaking things down into visuals is often helpful, especially when we're talking about more complex things. So bookmark this for future reference, and we'll return to it throughout the course. But let's take a look at the individual levels of the pyramid before we tie it to the modified Bronfenbrenner model I talked about earlier. So this first level here, attitudes and beliefs, this is the bottom of the pyramid because it is quote unquote the least serious and most widespread behavior. So while attitudes and beliefs might not always be actual acts of violence, violent acts are almost always supported by a specific set of attitudes and beliefs. So thinking about what we talked about last week, what do you suppose those attitudes and beliefs could be that support violent acts? Think about it. The next level is acts of prejudice and discrimination, and I'm just going to talk about these in combination for now. Now we start moving into quote unquote actual acts. We don't usually think of prejudicial or discriminatory acts as violent. When we think violence, we don't think discrimination. But like attitudes and beliefs, they often occur before, typical quote unquote violent acts. And we'll talk more about what discrimination and acts of prejudice are later in the course. Just know that they're on here. Moving up the pyramid, we look at violent acts. And so these are both what we think of as quote unquote typical violent acts, so rape, murder, assault, whatever, and maybe some we don't think of as typical. And again, we'll talk more about specifics throughout the course. And finally, we look at the top of the pyramid, we look at war and genocide. And now this is the top of the pyramid because it is quote unquote the most serious and the least common behavior. So I'm going to try to draw some arrows here. And like I said, forgive me for my terrible drawing skills. But the orange arrow here, if you go down the pyramid, you go from least common up here to most common down here. And then the purple arrow on the left, if you go up the pyramid, you go from least serious down here to most serious down up here. So the more serious an act gets, the less common it is generally. Now, obviously there are exceptions. This is just kind of a general understanding of things. So how do these two diagrams, the one I talked about, the Bronfenbrenner model and this, relate to each other? Think about it for a sec. But I want you to know that a person's behavior may not be categorized as only one part of the pyramid. So if somebody does a behavior, it might not just be attitudes and beliefs or discrimination. It could be a number of different things. So the lines between these levels, this is just kind of the default graphic that's provided, should really be maybe dotted or non-existent. So the lines are not hard set. It's not like this is just an attitude and belief issue. It can move around. It's also important to know that while behaviors at the lower levels of the pyramid do not always lead to behaviors at the upper levels, upper level behaviors almost always occur because behaviors at the lower level were viewed as okay. So what I mean by this is that while, if somebody has certain attitudes and beliefs, that doesn't mean they're going to commit violence. It might, but it doesn't mean they're going to. But if somebody commits violent acts, it's almost always because they had certain attitudes and beliefs, and those attitudes and beliefs were viewed as okay, so they were allowed to continue. So going back to how these are related, this pyramid describes specific behaviors, okay? So, we've got attitudes and beliefs, we've got acts of prejudice, we've got discrimination, violent acts, and war and genocide. These are specific behaviors. The previous diagram, the circles, describe levels of interaction at which behaviors may occur. So some behaviors on this pyramid may occur at any level of interaction. So violent acts may be carried out on a micro level between two individuals. They might be carried out between two groups. They might be carried out between two systems, etc. Some behaviors on this pyramid are more likely to occur at a specific level of interaction. So, for example, genocide isn't something that's carried out between individuals. It's more of a kind of group level or system level behavior. So you're not generally going to see genocide at a micro level. But microaggressions, on the other hand, which we'll talk about next week, are individual to individual behaviors, or you generally see them, and you generally interact with them on an individual level. If this seems confusing, it's okay. It takes a minute to really process all of this. We'll revisit these diagrams several times throughout the semester. The main thing I want you to take away is that violence occurs in context, and we're going to look at the context of those at the different levels, and then we're going to look at different behaviors as well. There's almost always context. So again, take a break. If you need to digest, replay that, take some notes, do what you got to do. Look at the cute puppy for a minute. We'll be back. All right, one last look at the cute puppy, and we're going to move on. So let's look at violence that occurs at the quote-unquote micro level. So that smaller circle in our modified Bronfenbrenner. So violence at this level occurs between individuals. Or in the case of self-directed violence, it occurs between two aspects of the self. is related to attitudes and beliefs. So thinking back to the violence pyramid, violent behaviors that we see at a micro level or an individual level are often directly related to attitudes and beliefs, more so than our behaviors at a meso or macro level, which suggests that micro level violence is quite common in society. If you think about the types of violent behaviors you observe or hear about, maybe on a daily basis or a weekly basis, when you watch the news, when you go on social media, whatever, do you think that micro-level violence is common? Think about it. In this unit, we're going to cover 3 specific behaviors. So one is self-directed violence. We'll talk about what that means next week. We'll look at microaggressions next week. And then the following week, we'll look at interpersonal violence or violent acts that occur between 2 individuals, person-to-person violence. Tech wants to work with me here. This is a video. I'm not going to play it because you guys can play it on your own, but know that it's there. There's the link is in the notes, as well as it's also on our YouTube playlist, so you have access to that. I do want to mention before we get to takeaways that the video that is in there, and it's a TED Talk, provides an excellent example of how attitudes and beliefs influence actual acts of violence. So take the time to really watch it fully. And again, it's available in the slides that I posted on Blackboard. The link to it is also available in the notes if for whatever reason it's not working in the slides, and sometimes it doesn't. And it's also on our YouTube playlist, which is under supplemental materials on the left-hand column in Blackboard. So there are several places you can find it. But when you watch that video, I want you to think about what are some of the attitudes and beliefs the speaker talks about? How do they lead that speaker to commit a violent act, although unwillingly? And what are some of the attitudes and beliefs of the speaker's peers? And are they influential to the speaker? Do they provide a context for violence? So I want you to think about that when you watch that video. Again, if you need a written transcript of the video or closed captions or subtitles, those can be found at the link provided in the notes. Because it takes you right to the TED website. But I want to get to some of the takeaways for this because, this isn't a super long lecture, but it's kind of an intense subject matter. There's a lot to talk about. So some takeaways are that violence does not occur in a vacuum or out of the blue, or very rarely does it. There's almost always a context behind it, and the context is going to be those lower levels of the pyramid, usually. There are 2 models that we'll revisit throughout the semester. So the first is that modified Bronfenbrenner, or the circles, and that looks at the levels of society in which behaviors occur. So we're going to look at a micro level in this unit, and that's just kind of an individual to individual level of society. The second model we're going to revisit is the violence pyramid, and that looks at actual behaviors. So Bronfenbrenner looks at the level of society in which the behavior occurs, and the violence pyramid looks at the actual behavior itself. I'm hoping this is simplified enough that you're getting it. I know it's a lot, but if you have questions, we can always talk about it more. So that's what I have for you guys. Be sure to watch the TED video. On Thursday, I will release the Virtual Class Activity 1, or VCA1, and that'll be released at 12:30 p.m. on Thursday, and you'll have until 12:30 p.m. on Friday to complete it. Remember, next week we'll meet in person, and if you have questions, again, feel free to email me or email a classmate or email Manny. Hopefully this video works out for you guys, and stay warm because it's supposed to be hella cold this weekend, and I will see you next week.